yo, Literal aka Mega Blitz. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the top 5 hardest Pokemon decks to play in our current standard metagame. Now, I had done the top 5 easiest Pokemon decks in the current standard metagame as well, and a lot of that same kind of rules are going to apply for this video as well, being what qualifies it for easiest or hardest deck is going to be based on that core just functionality of the deck. How kind of complex can the deck really get, as opposed to the easiest one, how simplistic the deck is to pick up and play. And a lot of these harder decks you're going to see are playing a lot of one-ofs and have a lot of different lines that you have to do to kind of maximize the deck's potential. But even the core strategy is still relatively complex. So now let's jump right in to that 5th spot. Alrighty, here at that number 5 spot, Dragapult EX with Dusknoir. Now, I was gonna originally put just the Dragapult variant with no Dusknoir. However, I feel like both decks are just as complex, but this one just has a couple more moving pieces to it that you have to manage. And that being the Dusknoir, and Dusclops lines, right? You have the Rare Candy in there, so you can Rare Candy into the Dusknoir, Curse Blast, but you're giving your opponent a prize card when you do it, just to put 13 damage counters on one of your opponent's Pokemon. So you not only are you giving your opponent prize cards, but you also have that Dusknoir basically putting 13 damage counters on one of your opponent's Pokemon, pairing that with the Dragapult EX's attack Phantom Dive, 200 damage to the active, and then you put 6 damage counters on your opponent's Pokemon any way you like. Specifically, they're a benched Pokemon. You can't put 6 damage counters on the active. That would be a little busted. So 6 damage counters anywhere you like on the benched Pokemon. Now, with that being said, the reason this deck is so difficult is because counter manipulation is very important in this deck. You're trying to take multiple prizes a turn, sometimes even all 6 of your prizes at once, using the Curse Blast from the Dusclops and the Dusknoir, using that Phantom Dive, and the Painful Spoons ability as well from your Radiant Alakazam, being able to move up to 2 damage counters from one of your opponent's Pokemon to another one of their Pokemon. Now, the reason I put this here at the number 5 spot is because the deck can become very complex with all these different damage counters moving around and stuff, but also at the same time, some of your matchups are just Phantom Dive, put the 6 damage counters wherever, it doesn't matter, and then Phantom Dive again, put the 6 damage counters wherever, it doesn't matter. But in certain other matchups, where you place your counters and where you move them to and when you Curse Blast is so crucially important into how this deck functions. On top of the Recon Directive, look at the top 2 cards, you put one into your hand, the other one to the bottom. Knowing what to grab and when to grab off those 2 cards is pretty important. Knowing when to use your Crispin, when to Roxanne, when to Iono, where to put energies, when to prioritize attaching Sparkling Crystal to something is very important, because this deck is very limited on its energies and things like that, and what, you know, when you're attaching them, because a lot of your damage is coming from giving your opponent prize cards with that Dusknoir Curse Blast ability. So that is reason here why that deck made it to the number 5 spot. I think Dragapult just with Dusknoir is a little more complex than without the Dusknoir, because it adds that element of, you know, 13 damage counters going somewhere, but also giving up prize cards as well. So Dragapult Dusknoir making it here to the 5th spot. It almost was the honorable mention, but we'll get to the honorable mention when the time comes. Moving into our 4th spot here, we have Gardevoir EX. Now, Gardevoir EX has been around for quite some time. We've seen very different innovations of Gardevoir EX. We've seen it with Shining Arcana Gardevoir. We've seen Turbo Gardevoir. We've seen more control variants of Gardevoir. There's Banette Gardevoir now as well. Gardevoir EX is not only a good just support Pokemon, but a good attacker as well when you need it to be. But the reason the deck is here on just this list at the top 5 hardest Pokemon decks to play is because you really need to prioritize when you're attacking with what and where you're moving damage counters, very similar to the Dragapult deck, because we've got that Monkey Dory in here with that Adrenaline Brain ability. If it has Dark Energy attached, you may move up to 3 damage counters from one of your Pokemon to one of your opponent's Pokemon. So, you know, putting all these energies with that Psychic Embrace ability onto our Screamtail, onto our Drifloon, and then moving some of them with the Monkey Dory can be pretty crucial, because especially in certain matchups where you're trying to hit those big numbers like 330 damage, 310, 320 with your Drifloons, that Adrenabrain ability from your Munkidori is going to be crucial in order to one-shot a Charizard EX or a Dragapult or another Gardevoir or anything like that. Now, the other reason I wanted to put this deck here on this list is because your resource management is super important when playing this deck. You really need to know where some specific cards are and any pretty much matchup you're going to be playing with. And some of those cards are going to be your super rods, are going to be very important to know how many you have, where they're at, have you played them, and things like that, and when to play them in just about any matchup, because you're going to be recycling your Drifloons, your Screamtails, your Munkidoris, and even some of your energies as well back into your deck, on top of things like your Klefki having that disruption ability, being able to just shut down abilities as well. Your Screamtail being able to hit things on the bench is pretty important. So you have this kind of controlled tempo style of a deck going on, but you also need to be fast enough, which we see here in that turbo variant with that secret box, being able to discard 3 cards in your hand and grabbing, I think it's a supporter, a stadium, an item, and I think a Pokemon maybe. I can't remember off the top of my head, but we see that card in there for that turbo variant to go really quickly, but it's still really important to be able to play fast and know your resources and where they're at any given time. And like I said, your damage counters moving around with the Adrenabrain on top of, you know, how many, you have to make sure you have enough energies in your discard pile to be able to Psychic Embrace them to your Drifloons and your Screamtails and stuff. And Gardevoir is a really strong deck. I just feel like every time I've played Gardevoir, it feels like I'm just using calculus to play a game of Pokemon sometimes, and it's very difficult. And Drifloon and Screamtail are mostly the causes of that. But those are the reasons why Gardevoir made it to this list, having to manipulate damage counters with the Adrenabrain and removing even more damage counters sometimes with that Moonlit Hill from our Pokemon to attach more damage counters onto it to hit for more damage. It really becomes a huge math game, and if you're not fluent enough in the deck to understand all that deep functionality with it and what to do in specific matchups, it can become very difficult. And like I said, you have to prioritize specific cards like Super Rods, your energies, and things like that in every matchup you're going to be playing. So that's why Gardevoir made it here to the 4th spot. Moving into the 3rd spot here, we have Lost Zone Box. Now, Lost Zone Box has kind of fallen in and out, but any Lost Zone box you're going to be playing, mostly this version here or Lost Sablezard, I feel like are the 2 hardest Lost Box decks to play. But any Lost Box deck, you're going to have the same kind of core simple problem, we'll say, when playing that deck. And that's going to be your Flower Selectings and your Courses Experiment. And what I mean by that is, looking at the top 2 cards of your deck, one of them goes into the Lost Zone, right? So that card is gone forever. And with that happening, you kind of run into this problem where you have to make so many important micro decisions as the game progresses. And if you put certain things in the Lost Zone, you can never get them back. So let's just say in a hypothetical world, you put 2 Mirage Gates in your Lost Zone and you haven't got a chance to check your prizes or anything yet, and you have 2 of your other Mirage Gates prized, you're not playing a Mirage Gate for quite some time. So it's really difficult to know what to prioritize in specific matchups with Lost Box, because you're constantly using that Flower Selecting, you're using your Courses Experiment, because you need to be able to get to the couple specific numbers in Lost Box, being 4 for the first one for that Cramorant to be able to attack for free, and then 7 for your Mirage Gates to be able to attach energy to your Pokemon, and then 10 to be able to use that Lost Mine attack from your Sableye, which then goes into why the deck is even more complex, because you have 12 damage counters that you're allowed to place wherever you want on your opponent's Pokemon. And like I had said in previous decks, counter manipulation is very difficult in the Pokemon trading card game to kind of manage and keep track of and follow up on in future turns as well. So not only on top of your micromanaging the entire game start to finish with your Flower Selectings and your Courses Experiment, but you also have the counter manipulation with the Sableye, and then you have specific cards that are teched for specific matchups in the entire standard metagame. Iron Hand's super good in the Lost Box Mirror match. It's good against Water-type Pokemon and Squawkabilly EX specifically as well, and it's also just really good into like decks like Gardevoir that play single prize Pokemon, so you can take extra prize cards. You have Blood Moon Ursaluna as kind of an end game finisher, but also is used a lot of the times as a mid-game attacker as well, because 240 is an insane amount of damage to be hitting on a basic Pokemon. Then you have Cramorant as kind of your other early game attacker, just being able to attack for free. You have Raikou V in there as well to be able to attach your Forest Seal Stone if you're playing that in here as well, to be able to use that Star Alchemy ability, on top of the fact that it's also good into decks like Lugia and other water type decks, and being able to punish decks like Terapagos where your bench gets really wide, and Miraidon so you can kind of race them as well. Then you also have Radiant Greninja, not only as a draw engine, but an attacker as well. Being able to attack with that Moonlight Shuriken in this deck is something you can do, and it is very crucial in the early game turns against decks like Dragapult and Charizard and Gardevoir and even the Lost Box decks, punishing those decks that aren't playing Manaphy. So that is the reason why Lost Box here has made its way into the 3rd spot. But the deck isn't always complex. Sometimes you end up getting these really easy flower selectings where it's the same card. Flower selecting, it's 2 Buddy Poffins. Well, I guess I'm taking a Buddy-Buddy Poffin. But then sometimes you get a flower selecting where you know that you don't need that card. Let's say if you have every piece you need and you go flower selecting and it's your Prime Catcher and your Asuian Heavy Ball, chances are you're probably not going to take the Asuian Heavy Ball if you already have your Comphase and you have Sableye, if you have Cramorant, and you know that Iron Hands and Blood Moon Ursaluna is in the deck, you don't really need the Heavy Ball, so you can pitch that too. So there are times where your flower selectings and your Courses Experiment are very easy to pick up and know what you need, but there are times where they are going to put you through the ringer. As someone who has played Lost Tina an extensive amount, I promise sometimes those flower selectings and those courses are not your friend. But moving into the 2nd spot here, we got Snorlax Stall. Now, Block-Lax is a very interesting deck in how it functions. You don't win by taking prize cards. You win by either decking your opponent out, or your opponent concedes because they know that they've lost. Now, a lot of the times when playing Snorlax Stall, people won't concede unless they know that they can't come out of it at all. And even then, sometimes they still won't do it, because Block-Lax is known to be one of probably the most hated decks in the current standard metagame right now. But you cannot argue that Block-Lax is a good deck. It's very solid, and on top of that, Block-Lax is a deck that requires a lot of finesse to play properly. Now, this is the 60 that I've been playing of Snorlax Stall lately. I had won a league challenge with it just a couple weeks ago. I've played it in tons of online tournaments. I've played on the ranked ladder. So this is my 60 that I've been playing of Snorlax Stall. And the way the deck functions is you're trying to trap your opponent's Pokemon that they don't want in the active spot with your Snorlax in the active so it can't retreat, or making it so your opponent can't basically attack into your Mimikyus because they're playing all EXs and Vs and aren't playing canceling clones. Or you have Cornerstone Mask Ogerpon EX with this ability being able to prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by your opponent's Pokemon that have an ability. On top of not decking yourself, but you need to know what supporter to play and when to play it. And that's where this deck really becomes difficult, because you're not only playing Eerie, so you're trying to shred their hand a little bit, discard some of those rare candies in their hand so they can't get into their Charizard, but you're also playing Misfortune Sisters. Look at the top 5, discard any item cards you find there. You're playing Giacomo, you're playing 4 pennies because you need to be able to make sure they're not taking prize cards to win the game, and you're playing a lot of this just kind of one turn. You can only play one supporter a turn, so you need to know what supporter to play and when to play it and how to play into each of those matchups. For example, Misfortune Sisters into Lugia is an awful card most of the time. They don't really play that many items, 4 Ultra Ball, 4 Capturing Aroma, maybe a couple Great Balls, maybe a Nest Ball or 2. Most of their deck is Pokemon and Energy. So playing a Misfortune Sisters over an Erica's Invitation if there's bench space is probably not ideal. You'd rather play the Erica's Invitation because you're more likely to hit a Pokemon in their hand than you are to hit an item that you actually care about discarding on the top of their deck. And you also would rather play, Giacomo in that matchup as well, as opposed to playing Airy. what do you get out of Eerie? Eerie or Lugia opponent, discard Capturing Aroma. Giacomo, you discard a special energy from each of their Pokemon. That's way more beneficial. And then, of course, you also have other tech cards in there like 0-6 Machinations, being able to force your opponent to discard down to 3 cards in their hand, which can also be pretty helpful into like Stall Mirrors, into Pidgeot Control. Gardevoir is another really good deck. Banette Gardevoir is another good deck that it's really well into as well. And I feel like for that reason, that's why Stall has made it here into that second spot for me, because it's such an unconventional way to win a game, and you have to make sure you're playing the right supporter when to play them, on top of being able to make sure that you have the Pokemon in play that you need to be able to play the game. You got to make sure you have your Snorlaxes in play, your Mimikyu if you need it, your Cornerstone Mask Ogerpon. You got to have the Rotom sometimes in play, even if it's a liability, so you can be drawing cards to find those supporters that you need each of those turns. On top of being able, towards the end of the game, you have Team Yell's Cheer, and then of course you have Silene to be able to put stuff back into your deck, but you have 3 PAL pads. So you need to also make sure you're not decking yourself. So you're going, okay, Team Yell's Cheer, put 3 supporters back into my deck. PAL pad, put Team Yell's Cheer and another supporter back into my deck. Pass, right? So you have to also make sure you're prioritizing your own discard pile on top of trapping your opponent and milling them at the same time. The deck is super difficult to play at times, but if you can understand the inner workings of Snorlax Stall, this deck is truly one of the most rewarding things to play with, especially if you can win. It's so rewarding and it feels incredible. Now, let's move into that honorable mention real quick here. We have Banette Gardevoir. Now, I wasn't, like I said, I was either going to swap Banette Gardevoir with that 5th spot being Dragapult, but Dragapult, with its much damage counter manipulation as it has just as much with, or if not, it has just as much as Banette Gardevoir, I feel like, but you're not having the giving up prize card element that Dragapult does. And the reason I put Banette Gardevoir here is because a lot of the times you're just item locking your opponent and then Psychic Embracing energies to your active Banette, retreating, Psychic Embrace to the active Banette that you retreated into, Adrenabrain, move 3 damage counters, Everlasting Darkness, you can't use items. And I feel like a lot of the times that's kind of how the deck functions. It's a lot of, I'm going to item lock you, you can't play items, I'm going to Adrenabrain and slowly take my prize cards. What are you going to do about it? And I feel like a lot of the times when playing Banette, you can win a lot of games just by, okay, I have a Gardevoir in play, I have a Monkey Dory, I have 2 Banettes, and I have energy in my discard pile. What's your answer? And you can just retreat loop on top of attach, Adrenabrain, move damage counters, Everlasting Darkness. You can't do anything about it. That's okay. Or you also have the other element where you trap something in the active spot, like a Babero that they don't want, or maybe that Lumineon V that's been sitting on the bench since the beginning of the game, and just Adrenabrain and move damage counters around. Or you also can go, okay, I'm going to Everlasting Darkness into this Lumineon as well, Radiant Alakazam, move the damage counters, and just take prize cards from the bench slowly to win the game. And Banette Gardevoir is a deck, I don't want anyone to think that I don't think Banette Gardevoir is a hard deck by any means, because I do think it is a difficult deck to play, but I feel like you can kind of just cheese your way into a decent amount of wins sometimes, depending on what decks you're playing against. So for example, I feel like Banette Gardevoir has a really good time into Snorlax Stall, because you're item locking your opponent. They can't play their Pokegears, they can't play PAL pads, and you can't shut off any abilities unless you go Mimikyu, but then they just Adrenabrain and move the damage counters off their stuff anyway with that retreat loop and knock out your Mimikyu. So Banette Gardevoir does have tons of difficult lines to it, but a lot of the times you're item locking and you're doing kind of the similar thing over and over and over again, and then every once in a while you go, okay, Poltergeist hit for huge damage, take a couple prize cards, and go on. So now, let's move in to that number 1 spot here. Number 1 spot is going to be Pidgeot Control. Pidgeot Control is one of the hardest decks I've ever tried to pick up and play. You have so many one-ofs. You have to prioritize getting your Pidgeot into play on top of being able to prioritize what supporter to play like you do with Snorlax Stall. You have to prioritize getting your Pidgeot in play, being able to set up your different kinds of Pokemon that you need, being able to Fang Snipe early on in the game is super helpful to discard their cards from their hand and have the disruption. This is All Out Blitzel's list. And if you want any information on playing any Pidgeot Control deck, definitely check out All Out Blitzel. They know how to be playing Pidgeot Control, and it's absolutely insane. But I will say, this is a deck that if you can truly master and understand Pidgeot Control and how to play it, this deck can be almost unstoppable. You have almost every answer to anything in the metagame. You have the Bloodmoon Ursaluna penny loops that you can do at the end of the game. You have the Ogerpon EX Sabra, like block lax, you can't retreat element. You have the Ogerpon, the Cornerstone Mask Ogerpon to block Charizards. You have the Luxray V to be able to disrupt their opponent's hand and discard cards from their hand. You have the 4 Mimikyus, the Safeguard ability. You have the Rotom with the instant charge. You have the Eerie. You have Penny, Misfortune Sisters. You have cool Thornton plays you can make. But the reason this deck is in the #1 spot is because of that reason itself. There's so many one-ofs and so much stuff you have to keep track of in this deck that I couldn't even begin to try to explain how to play this deck. I've tried to play Pidgeot Control a handful of times, and every time I've tried to play, I just don't quite get what I should be doing and when I should be doing it, because there's so many decisions you have to make at such a crucial point at each point in the game that it's so much. But once again, this deck has proven itself to be incredibly powerful. People play it to regionals and they day 2 with it. People making top cut with it. It's winning online tournaments. And like I said, All Out Blitzel literally is probably the best person to look at when it comes to Pidgeot Control stuff. So definitely check out his channel. But that is my #1 pick, and it's going to be that Pidgeot Control deck because, like I said, it's not a linear strategy. The linear strategy is figuring out what one-of supporter, when to play it, what's the best move, when is the best move, what to quick search for, on top of when to instant charge, what to bench, when to bench it, making sure you get the Pidgeot EX set up. You also have the attacking element of the deck. You can mill your opponent as well. And that's why the deck is here at that #1 spot. So now let's jump right in to that outro. Alright, that's gonna do it for today's video on the top 5 hardest Pokemon decks to play in the current metagame. Now, if you want to check out a video about the top 5 easiest Pokemon decks in the current metagame, I'll make sure to post that little clip box at the end of the video, so definitely click on that and check it out. As well, check out all my social media links with the Twitter account, the Discord link, and I'm going to be starting streaming on Twitch here pretty soon, so definitely be there to check that out. But most importantly, I want to thank you guys for all the support throughout this entire journey on YouTube. So if you haven't yet, don't forget to leave a like, smash a subscribe button. I would appreciate it. And I'll see you all in the next one. Peace!